So I'm going to open up the floor to questions. I'll take 3 at a time, and then we'll go and take questions from our global audience. Please go ahead. I need a working pen, so can I borrow? So mine's broken. Yeah, great. Yeah, go ahead.
Really,
Please, first of all, sorry, can you state your name and your affiliation?
my name is Banna, and I'm from Humanitarian Forum. We are not admitting that the international system, if not failing, is failed on all the grounds. And this is something very serious. We're not admitting that actually they are not ready or they don't want to sort the conflicts happening in Yemen, happening in Iraq, happening in Libya, happening, and the reasons behind this. Let me tell you something that actually we agreed as government, as countries, to fight a monster called terrorism without putting a definition on methodology of fighting terrorism. And we're going blindly. Each country is fighting it separately. I visited Yemen 2 times last year.
Do you have a question? Is there a question?
I visited Yemen last year twice.
Mm-hmm.
I went to many hospitals, to Al-Sab'in Hospital, to Al-Jumhuri Hospital, in Aden, in Sana'a, in Hudaydah. And what I can say that de-risking is risking the life of people. De-risking is increasing the corruption, as Sherine said nicely in her very detailed and good report. And de-risking is increasing terrorist activities and smuggling of arms and making illegal arms deal. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To the gentleman over here, please.
James Spencer from the BYS. 2 quick thoughts. The first one is on federalism and regional development. Great idea. The problem is that most embassies like dealing with central government because that's a single point of contact and you can have one DFID person to deal with one person in the central government. If you want to deal with 19, 20, 21 provinces, then you probably have to have at least 5 more staff, and that gets expensive so the odds of it happening, very sensible as it is, because it solves the problem, is fairly slim. The issue of de-risking, fundamentally, it's a risk and reward scenario. Places like Yemen, South Sudan, the Sahel, the rewards to the banks are limited, so the risks for getting it wrong are high. So beating up the banks is unlikely to work. DFID, off the top of my head, have something like $1 billion sitting in World Bank reserve funds. Why, particularly as we leave the EU, doesn't the UK set up a development bank, which is absolutely transparent, auditable, and also demands transparency and auditability of its partners in country, and is therefore able to fire funds into places where Islamic relief, etc., need it, possibly take funding from individuals that can go to named individuals, and fundamentally put government money where the risk to the commercial sector is too much.
One more question. Ian.
Oh, hi. I'm Richard Hi, I'm Richard Stanford from Oxfam. I want to just agree with so many of the comments that have been highlighted. Certainly as Oxfam, we cannot take over from the private sector. Oxfam and humanitarian agencies cannot feed 10 million or 26 million people. And it's critical that we look both at the humanitarian problems, which are very important, and the difficulties we're facing with issues like bank de-risking, but also, but also with the problems that the private sector are facing, because it's the private sector that basically will save Yemen. And we've asked the UK government, we've brought Yemenis from local organisations to the UK, and ministers here have refused to give them funds. We want the funds to go to local organisations. We want livelihoods. People are asking for livelihoods. And my comment or question, really, the final one, is there's something called the task force that was set up by Mark Carney, the Financial Stability Task Force. And I heard about it about a year or so ago when we all started facing problems with this issue of sending funds into Yemen. And I just wondered if the panel knows any more about it and whether there's been any movement from central banks around the world to try and find a way around this.
Okay, I'm going to start with you, Sherine. So why doesn't DFID set up something like a development bank that can take in all the contributions? And do you have any idea about that?
It's an interesting idea. It is an interesting question. Why doesn't that happen? But I think it would still not resolve the problem. I don't think a bank is going to resolve the crisis in Yemen today. Ultimately, it will have to be through the empowerment of, as we mentioned, the local capacities, the private sector. And you know what? Yemenis don't want to live off handouts, right? They want... Yeah, they want livelihood opportunities, as you mentioned. They want dignified pathways towards livelihood and living a decent life. And I think that while this would be, it is an idea, but if it is already contributing towards the humanitarian assistance and towards development assistance in Yemen, it's never going to be enough without empowering local capacities, without facilitating financial access to the private sector and humanitarian organizations, without resolving some of the political problems that exist in Yemen today, without removing, I think, the trusteeship of particular countries over Yemen. Unless that happens and Yemenis are able to take control of their fate and be able to contribute positively towards their own economy, then a solution to the problem is never going to be long term. The other point that I want, because the question of local governance has been brought up several times by the panel as well in your question. And I want to say something about this. I think the nation-state system is the system that works around the world. There will have to be an exchange amongst governments. A federal system may work for Yemen, definitely, but you need to have a functioning government. You will need to have a functioning central bank. The way things work in Yemen today, you've got like 4 different central banks, each one of them commanding a particular territory. So using more investment into local capacity is important, but it is never going to replace a political solution and having a functioning, overarching government. So I just wanted to comment on that as well.
Have you heard about the task force? I thought maybe Imran, you could answer this one.
Well, I'm not a finance expert, but I mean, I'd like to sort of, refer to the kind of question about DFID money, if I can. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we would all recognise that DFID has, in many of these humanitarian crises, has put significant amounts of money into the responses. It has supported the humanitarian response. But what we're really saying is that, really when we look at this, the most significant humanitarian crisis of our day, we need to see more of a moral outrage, not just from the people of this country, but from the government. We need to see that expressed very clearly. We need to see the political action that matches those humanitarian commitments. It is the biggest humanitarian crisis. It's an appalling crisis, and we need to see that matched in political action and efforts to bring peace to the country. So I think, there are opportunities, and we have, DFID has been great. It's been very innovative. When you look at the START network and the sorts of projects it's been funding, it's been quite innovative. It's been very committed to the whole process of localization, ensuring that we're building the local capacity, because they've been funding programs within the START network to do that. But where they really held back is really a debate about how can we get DFID money into those local national humanitarian platforms without going through the subsidiarity process of giving it to Islamic Relief, giving it to somebody else, giving it to somebody else, to somebody else. We have opportunities to be innovative, to pilot programs to ensure that we can get our money from this country as directly to those local national platforms as we can, and there are clear models available for us to do that. And really, why not try with Yemen as an example of innovation and cutting through the rhetoric to say that we're absolutely committed to building that local national capacity by transferring cash from the UK to those local national platforms. And I think, we're talking about regionalisation. I think, okay, there are opportunities now to move away from that centralisation, through those local and national platforms in the regions, in the provinces, and there are great opportunities for money to be transferred directly to those areas. I don't think it has to always go through the capital city.
Can we take more questions? I don't think... Yeah, we haven't got any from our global audience yet. Saleh, please.
Yeah, Saleh from the Disasters Emergency Committee. I think certainly the UK public has shown an interest in Yemen, and despite the little coverage, huge praise to you, Noel, for obviously your work in reporting the story. Well done. I think.
There's really no need. Thank you.
But moving on really from the humanitarian agenda and really going to the political side, isn't the continuous failed peace talks really been sort of continuing the war? And really now, shouldn't the international community recognise the realities on the ground? That Yemen is effectively now 3, maybe 4 different states, certainly 2 different governments, maybe even 3. And the recognition of the state of Yemen now by the international community and really negotiating with the local players is probably the start of the end of the war. By continuing to talk to the legitimate government and to the Houthis, there's been a binary sort of place to the war. I think we're all, or certainly the international community, is complicit in maintaining that war. And that may be, sadly, part of that war economy that's going on with major powers around the world supplying, obviously, the Saudi coalition with arms. So the question is, are we all complicit in this war by not recognising the realities and helping really to negotiate a proper local or regional peace deal that will try to rebuild and reconstruct Yemen?
I'll take 2 more questions before we go for answers. From that side.
Thank you. My name is Laurie Joshua, and I work as a freelance consultant with the UN. I mean, one of the things that strikes me at the moment about Yemen is the fact that in Yemen we have a unique situation whereby for the first time we have the World Bank and the IMF working alongside the UN. So for Yemen, last year the World Bank put in $1 billion, channeled through the UN partners, UNDP, UNICEF, WHO, FAO. And I think that mechanism is beginning to open up the framework for both discussing humanitarian relief, but also looking at the transition to recovery and future development. So I think there are platforms which are emerging in Yemen, which will, if fostered and supported, will provide a framework for innovation in terms of looking at how the future emerges. These are examples of, for example, very practical things like the Social Welfare Fund, which has been injected with $250 million. The Social Fund for Development, another $250 million. WHO on programs of that nature. And it involves working through the government in Sana'a and the government in Aden, as well as other partners. So all I just wanted to emphasize, not so much a question, as drawing attention to the fact that there are new platforms which are emerging and hopefully yield dividend going forward. Thank you.
I don't know.
Hi, my name is Duncan Hart from Crown Agents. Baraa, you talked about the informal money remittance system. How important is that for Yemen? How is it going to face the same problems that with the de-risking of the formal system has faced? I know in Somalia, for example, the Hawala system was really important throughout the 2000s, but then it faced the same issues with clamping down on how it operates. Is that happening in Yemen? Is it something that may come around the corner if the system grows?
Can you pass the microphone to the lady in front of you, please?
Lizzie Hobbs from King's College. Just kind of in Afghanistan, there was quite a lot of observation that counter-terror legislation really inhibited humanitarian organisations from kind of engaging with non-states to gain access. And I just wondered whether this was a dynamic you'd seen in Yemen at all.
Great. Okay, let's start with, are we all complicit in this war? Who shall we? Noel, would you like to answer that?
Well, just back to the peace process side of that. I mean, there is now a new envoy is being appointed this week, I think. It might even be British. One of the lead candidates is British. And I think clearly, people feel that there is time for a fresh look at how one goes about peace. And I'm sure this will happen whoever gets appointed as envoy. But at the same time, you have to deal with the realities of who's fighting each other. I mean, essentially, at the end, it's the Houthis, so to speak, against the coalition, and the peace deal has to be done between these two. And what I think one needs to try and hope for is the sort of thing we almost reached in 2016, when the peace there was a peace plan which involved implementing bits of 2216 and also political changes in Yemen. So you'd have maybe with some arms withdrawal from this city in exchange for the creation of vice president or presidential council. The next step would be further moves, and then finally we would see President Hadi resign, and there would be a coalition government formed. I mean, I think whatever, in the end, that's probably we're going to end up something like this, but that will have to be gone through the peace process. I think what's happened locally is clearly important in development terms, and I see this particularly. I mean, maybe Mohammed can talk about in Hadramaut. There are and Bahra, there are these areas where there has been no war fighting. You have to remember, in that part of Yemen, there hasn't been a war. And there's quite a significant diaspora which is able to support development. So it's a question of building on that locally. And just finally on the south, I mean, the STC, I think, it might be a means of trying to bring the south together, building what somebody made the point that going too local. This is an antidote to that, if it works. Yeah.
Imran, what do you think about the question the lady asked?
About the kind of the effect of counterterrorism. I mean, if we use our own kind of experience in places like Syria, Yemen, and other countries where there are clearly issues with armed groups and terrorist groups, the very difficult choices that we make as an organisation, because one of our greatest strengths is reach. I mean, we have a capacity to negotiate access, but what we see in many cases is where we have actual practical reach. We have the ability to work in a particular area, but we choose not to, and the reason for that is that it's just not possible for us to be working close in an area that's occupied by an armed group that is a known terrorist group. It's just too risky for us, and that's a very difficult thing for us to admit and accept, because we have this in our DNA, this instinctive thing about getting to almost beyond reach communities. We've been very successful in reaching it, and it's not a practical thing. It's actually about assessing what might happen in certain situations. If something that's stolen off the back of a WFP truck and there's a picture of a terrorist with a WFP sack. Well, WFP can roll with the punches. I mean, it's not going to be, immediately accused of being a terrorist supporter. But if it's an organisation that's like Islamic Relief or another Muslim agency or similar, we're in a very difficult and different place. So it's a sad reality that in so many countries, whilst we are doing our utmost to reach many vulnerable communities, there are situations where we decide not to enter a particular area because of that particular scenario.
But can you answer the gentleman's question on the Hawala system? What are the challenges it would face on the ground in Yemen?
Sure. And if you would allow me, I would like to reflect then back quickly on the political question regarding the Hawala system. I think it could face a similar challenge. I think we're still at an early age, so we don't know what might happen tomorrow. We know there is a system that exists and it is unofficial. But of course, there could be a risk if it grows bigger. Then there could be more de-risking measures against it. But I think this is only left for the future to decide. Quickly on the question about the political side, I would slightly disagree, because simply this would encourage any armed group who just have arm and can occupy a territory to actually just hold weapons, occupy a territory, and say, now we have a stake, now we want to be part of the table. These kind of discussions were happening slightly in 2016 when they were trying to talk to the parts, actually trying to encourage them to talk as political parties who once were engaged in a political dialogue. Now I think it further complicated things after the Houthis killed the former President Saleh and the targeting of the GPC, because now you cannot deal with them only as one side as the Houthis and the other side as the other side. Only if the other side are willing to be talking as sides independently, that's something else. But so far it's I think the second round of discussions then should involve them separately. But I think so far the situation will remain just as it is.
But I also think, I'm going to use my contributing chair card now. But covering the peace talks, I went to all 3 rounds. I think this is the first time right now that the international community is taking Yemen seriously, particularly the UK. It's now high up on the agenda. But, you know, going back to what you said earlier in your talk, is that the situation is very different now. I think Yemen had better prospects for salvaging the situation and prospects for peace earlier on in the conflict when the international community ignored it than it does now. Now it's a lot more complicated, it's a lot more fragmented, and it's going to take a lot more effort to come up with a peaceful process which keeps all the warring factions happy. And also going back to something you kept bringing up, the war economy. The war economy took a while to be set up and to be as, I would say, sophisticated as it is now. And it's one of the main reasons that we remain in this state of chaos. And trying to take that away from people on the ground now in Yemen is going to be a lot more complicated than it was during the first round of talks when we were in Geneva a few years ago, when the international community simply just didn't care about what was going on. More questions? Sorry, the gentleman on the back.
Thanks. Hello, Ben, Events Officer here at ODI, and we are experiencing some minor technical difficulties in passing on our online questions. So I thought I'd pose a couple of them to you.
Okay.
First one from Serge Veldhuizen. The UN is more or less non-existent in Yemen at the moment. What should the UN do to have a greater role in achieving peace?
I think what I just said answered that question, so that's that.
And a couple coming through on employment. So where do you see the opportunity to create jobs for vulnerable groups such as youth? And a question in particular for Baraa. From your perspective, what are the current livelihood opportunities within the region? Thank you.
One more question from here, please. This lady over here.
Thank you. I'm Molly Anders from DevEx. I wanted to ask specifically, I guess, what kind of advice you're giving to local partners in preparing for this, not just obviously preparing for it, but trying to see it through. I know it is hard to talk about reconstruction. What support do you get from DFID specifically on the localization effort and helping these local organizations cope?
So should we start with employment? So how to create more jobs? Sherine?
I think the creation of more jobs, I think the first access point towards the creation of more jobs is the Yemeni private sector. Remember that for the Yemeni private sector, their market is within Yemen. Their number one market is Yemen. And a previous study that I put together on the role of the private sector in the humanitarian response in Yemen did highlight the fact that the private sector is actively engaging on the ground, has access to different areas within the country, are familiar with the needs and are familiar with the capacities of their population. So there is a need. I think my response to that question would be to facilitate financial access for the private sector, help the private sector of Yemen to engage actively in that reconstruction process, but also at the moment in terms of providing livelihood opportunities and providing an active role within the humanitarian response. And it is international humanitarian organizations that can play this role at present by engaging with the private sector as partners, rather than simply considering them, actors on the ground, just giving them tasks to do this or the other, but actually engaging them within the response itself. And in the long term, via providing them with financial access globally, and I think that would be my response to livelihood opportunities.
What do you think, Baraa?
I think definitely the private sector. Once I started discussing about a reconstruction plan, whether it was in Aden or in Lahij, and I think the private sector should be a partner into that discussion, because we are addressing how can they remain and how they can be how can they remain sustainable under these current conditions. And the other thing is, actually, whenever we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about an opportunity to create jobs. And whenever there is discussions around infrastructure, it is an opportunity to actually an incentive for the local actors to move closer towards peace. So I think these are I would say like very clear, I think, opportunities we can address. And of course, the other thing is actually addressing the demands of the Yemeni people as they see them. We cannot say like this should happen or that should happen. They should be the ones who determine what they need, and it depends on the demands of each area or province or region, what are their priorities, instead of having just an agenda from far away.
Imran, what is your advice to local partners?
Well, I would say that, I mean, you know, be confident in your knowledge and your capacity. I mean, we know that they are often the frontline humanitarians. They receive something like 4% of direct humanitarian aid, and yet they deliver 70% of it. So we know that they are always at the front line delivering, you know, often in very difficult situations. So recognise that you've got that expertise. Capacity is an issue. There are definite challenges within capacity, issues around, you know, humanitarian standards, you know, finance processes, that sort of thing. So, you know, get to know your international NGOs and get to know where the capacity is, and get the training for your staff to ensure that you are, you know, ready to receive that level of support. But also when it comes to, you know, a recovery situation, and when we have the cluster system established, and we've seen this so many times, the UN will invite the international NGOs to a cluster meeting, and they all attend, and there's not a single national NGO around the table. And we had situations in the Philippines where we were working with a local NGO, and we felt so embarrassed by the lack of national NGOs around the table. And when we invited this national NGO, we thought that they would come rather intimidated by the UN system, and almost the moment that the UN Archer guy turned his microphone on, the guy started haranguing him, saying, how dare you not invite national NGOs? What is wrong with you guys? And I think that's it, you know. No, you have that influence. It's your right to be there in those meetings. You know, turn up. If you're not invited, just turn up and sit there and talk about what you have to say, because you will be definitely overlooked by the UN system. Unfortunately, it's still not working.
I think we've got time for one more round of questions. So, is there any questions that would please go ahead?
Hello.
Yeah.
Peter Asprey. Just two questions. One brief one is just about traditionally the share of you know, how much of money movements inside Yemen was in the informal sector and how much in the banking sector before stuff kicked off. But the bigger question is whether you can give any more granularity to this concept of a war economy, whether it's a sort of a war economy that's developing at a micro level, or whether it's sort of bigger resource extraction related, you know, international dimensions as well. Thank you.
Let's take two more.
The lady over there.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Caroline Anning from Save the Children. I wanted to ask about the issue of payment of public sector salaries, which you've touched on the panel, and kind of what could be done in the immediate term to address that. Certainly for us, and I know for other aid agencies on the ground, it's a huge issue, not just for the impact that it has on kind of millions of individual families, but also for the running of basic public services. So schools, particularly for us, but also hospitals, sewage, everything that you can imagine, as I'm sure you know. When we've spoken to UK officials about it before, they've said, you know, last year they were saying they were kind of putting pressure on the Saudis and then on Hadi to pay it from the central bank in Aden. Now when we speak to them, they say the responsibility is with the Houthis in the north to pay it themselves. And, it's quite hard to know where that responsibility sits and who actually has the ability to restart those salary payments. I wonder if you had any insights into that.
One more question before we take answers. Najah, please.
Hi, I'm Najah, and I'm from Islamic Relief.
It's
working.
Yeah.
I have just a comment on the back of what Imran mentioned with the UN system. I have a problem with all the numbers that have been mentioned of the amount of aid that Yemen receives, because we all know with the UN system, a lot of that amount goes to expats, a lot goes to the security system, and the average beneficiary hardly receives a few percentage of that amount. So I just have a problem with the numbers that were mentioned. And my question is, to the international community? To what extent are we implicit in recognizing Houthis as the government in Sana'a? It was mentioned that they are the actual government in Sana'a. So to what extent are we implicit in recognizing their role and somehow refueling this war? Thank you.
Shall we start with the war economy? Who wants to answer that one?
I can only refer you to, there's an excellent Chatham House report called Yemen, the Chaos State, which actually sets out to describe it. But what I think essentially it says is that it's partly the way that goods imported to Yemen pass first through normally through the what you might call legitimate government's customs, and then it moves to the Houthi areas where it's re-taxed again. And on the way, there are whole sorts of checkpoints, I think up to 25 on some routes, where money is extracted for local purposes. So a lot of people are making money out of that. In effect, also, the two governments are part of that. But that you could argue, is obviously legitimate. And beyond that, there is the control of distribution at either ends of certain key commodities. But it's that report actually goes into it. Yeah.
I mean, just to paint a picture of the war economy, when I was in Yemen a month ago, driving into Sana'a, there's a queue of trucks, and when I say queue, I'm talking around 200 trucks trying to make their way into Sana'a, and I was wondering why there was such a queue, and I realized that there's someone at a checkpoint that is taking cash from every single truck that comes in, depending on what they're carrying. And then as we were making our way into out of Aden, I think, it's the same thing. So it works in the same way in both sides. And that goes on to your question about the public salaries on the ground. I think even on the ground, people aren't sure, because the Houthis do have this taxation system where they're taking money from people as goods come into Sana'a, but it's and especially fuel. So there's a lot of money being made out of fuel coming into the north of Yemen. But how organized that is and whether that's enough money to pay all the public sector salaries is unclear. Personally, I think it could at least pay something. It's going to someone's pocket and it's probably funding the conflict itself. But it isn't clear, and that's why they keep passing the buck. So before Ali Abdullah Saleh died, the Houthis blamed it on Saleh, and Saleh blamed it on the Houthis. And now the Houthis have the finger pointed at them. And that's why the first month after he died, they paid half a month's public salary, because they realized that this could put them in very tricky water afterwards.
I wanted to say something about the war economy, and because you asked for like a more granular approach. I think the establishment and the creation of this class of money brokers is going to feed into that war economy. So what we're witnessing is not only a war economy that is stagnant, it's actually getting more complicated and including new actors and a whole new class of money brokers, not only because of the failure of the central bank in Yemen, but also because, as I mentioned, because of the counter-terrorism measures. You asked another question about to what extent were banking, was there banking penetration in the period prior to 2011 or even prior to the current crisis, 2015. There are no statistical figures that are readily available there. But from the conversations that I've had with bankers in Yemen from different levels, both working for government as well as private banks, there was a banking sector that was very vibrant and that was working very closely with international banks towards very heightened compliance mechanisms, and there were constantly meetings taking place both regionally as well as internationally, and all of that was taken to a whole new level, especially after 9/11, when they had to professionalize even further. So there was a functioning banking system in Yemen. What you want to avoid is a Somalia scenario, which you referred to, because with the situation in Somalia today is that you cannot survive really without the money transfer companies that exist, right? And it is the money transfer companies that are actually getting de-risked at the moment, and that is the problem with de-risking in Somalia. But you have a situation in Somalia where the central bank in Somalia does not have any oversight over the money transfer businesses. Now, you don't want to have a similar scenario in Yemen, where there was a banking sector, but now the banking sector is getting extremely weakened. You have an illicit and more informal sector that is emerging, that is slowly becoming part of that war economy that we were talking about. And the central bank in Yemen, once it gets more functional, God knows when that's going to happen, because it is primarily a political decision. When that happens, it might not be able to have the adequate oversight over all of those transfer companies, because they come with benefits. Okay, but they also come with the potential corruption. Any of the receipts that you get through any of those money transfer companies cannot be verified. For example, there are no systems of checks and balances. They're mostly about people connecting to one another. So yeah, I wanted to just comment on those points.
Noel, can you answer Najah's question on, are we implicit in calling, when we keep referring to the Houthis as the government of the north?
Well, I think,
are we not giving them some sort of credibility?
Well, I think again, certainly in my days in the Foreign Office, one recognised in terms of countries who's actually in control, and clearly in that terms, the Houthis are in control of that area, are in that sense, the authority. But it's just all the UN resolutions don't recognise this, and they did come to power by seizing power from Hadi in Sana'a in September 2014, forcing him into a particular agreement which they themselves didn't honour, and then leading to the tax on him in January. December and January, around the start of the war. So in that sense, they're clearly not legitimate, but in terms of the realities of dealing with the situation, clearly a peace deal will have to be done with the Houthis eventually.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you so much for this brilliant discussion. But before we end, I'm just going to give you all a minute to reflect on everything we've spoken about. Sherine, would you like to go first?
I have a few points just to wrap up. I think the first point is that there is an urgent need, and as that report mentions, a call for action to look at the implications and the impact that bank de-risking and counter-terrorism has had on a humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and that the fact that we've consolidated evidence to prove that it's opening a door, a pathway towards corruption, feeding into a war economy, must urge us to rethink the adequacy and the utility of counterterrorism measures. I think the path forward for Yemen needs to include a concerted international effort, calling for IHL abiding by international humanitarian law, to both the Saudi-led coalition as well as the Houthis, looking at the facts and understanding that humanitarian assistance that is given to Yemen today is never going to be enough unless there are long-term solutions that look towards a reconstruction of Yemen and more dignified livelihood opportunities for the people. And finally, that people who hold the key to the rebuilding of Yemen are the Yemeni people themselves. The World Bank and the IMF may work in Yemen today, but they're not going to be able to hold the key towards Yemen's future. The only way forward is to empower the local humanitarian sector, the local private sector. Those are the people who are going to save Yemen and the humanitarian crisis we're witnessing today. And the UK government, as well as the international community, has the obligation, as well as the moral obligation, in order to stand up for Yemen and support the Yemeni people rather than political agendas. Thank you.
Baraa, what are your reflections?
I think, in addition to what Sherine mentioned, is simply we need to address the demands of the people in the different regions as they are. I don't think there is a fixed or fit model that just fits everywhere. Sometimes we need to address the realities and how the situation is sometimes is complicated. It doesn't help just to oversimplify the problem. And I think also in addition to that, think about where there is opportunities and where we can work. There are many things that we find hard, and sometimes it's people are frustrated because there is a lack of political will from all sides to reach a solution. But at the same time, whenever there is an opportunity and chances, we need to work on that. And at the moment, there are at least a huge will at the local level that they want to empower themselves. They want to improve their livelihoods. They want to have a more sustainable solution for their daily living. So I think addressing that is important whenever we talk in forums or discussions around Yemen. And finally, is whenever there is opportunities and avenues to advocate, we need also to do that. One of the clear avenues we have today is that the Yemeni workers who are living in Saudi Arabia, many of them are risking of losing their jobs because of the extra measures put in by the Saudi new laws. If we can put enough pressure on that front, we are actually contributing to the many thousands of people living inside Yemen.
Imran, what are your reflections?
I mean, ultimately, I mean, we really had a major focus on the de-risking process and the effect it's had on the humanitarian system. And I think, you know, it's really an appeal to governments, to banks. I mean, it really starts with the governments, because the banks are really responding to what the governments really expect of them. To look at this issue and to realise that so many NGOs, I mean, Islamic Relief and others, are spending so much time and resources to ensure that they are, you know, compliant, that their due diligence is effective. And you know, if we could convert that sort of, you know, those resources into humanitarian action, that in itself would make a major difference. I mean, I think Sherine actually covered so many of my points, but because she really nailed it in terms of covering it. But I would also say that, you know, that there will be an end to the war at some stage, and at that stage I appeal to, you know, to the NGOs that are actually in country at the moment, and to the UN system, and to governments that are funding, you know, that future humanitarian response, to put, you know, that local and national humanitarian capacity at the heart of the response.
Noel.
Yes, one brief thing on this is not strictly my concern, but I was slightly surprised in the answers earlier. We didn't talk about agriculture and the rural areas where over 50% of people are employed. If we're going to look for jobs, it's got to be through restoring agriculture and addressing the experts now say about the water situation in relation to agriculture, going back to rain-fed agriculture, more intensive agriculture, less investment in the irrigated agriculture, which is draining the water. Bearing in mind, you know, that Taiz is already threatened with no water, and Salah may well be in the next 20 years. But on the actual issue is I think that I hope that the new change in the UN peace envoy will give a renewed chance to go forward with peace, and that's what I've got to see. Because the fact that both sides need to realise this war is unwinnable by either of them in the end. And the sooner they can realise that and come to an agreement and start offering hope to the Yemeni people, the better.
Thank you so much to all of you. I mean, I don't know what I can add after what you've all said, except that the time is now and something has to be done. There needs to be more pressure from the international community. And hopefully with the new UN envoy, there'll be a new fresh plan for a resolution that actually applies to the situation on the ground today. So thank you all for coming. The video of this event will be online tomorrow, and there's coffee outside, so you can still pick the brains of our panelists in the coffee room outside. Thank you so much.